Hitler Youths. The Hitler Youth of the Third Reich were not merely training groups, they were factories of fanatics. From childhood, the children were molded to obey without questioning and to hate without doubt. They grew up with a single purpose, to serve the Führer no matter the cost. By the time they reached adolescence, they were no longer just youths, but potential soldiers, ready to kill or even die for him. They were founded in 1922 as part of the Sturmabteilung. According to the figures for affiliation with the Nazi youth organizations, between 1923 and 1939, the growth curve was impressive. In 1923, 1,200 youths belonged to these organizations. By 1932, that number had risen to 107,000. The Nazis of Third Reich Germany undertook the transformation of one of the fundamental pillars of socialization, education. The indoctrination of German children and youths was essential to Hitler, since they were a part of society that was easily manipulated. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. The Nazi ideology was transmitted by every means, immersing the young in an environment in which the Nazis were the dominant race, the Jews a despicable caste, and participation in the war a true honor, all in order to reclaim a legitimate vital space. The youths allowed themselves to be seduced by these ideals, convinced that their path was the right one and tormented by the fear of disappointing their Führer. To their great surprise, at the end of the war, they realized that they had been deceived and manipulated by the Nazis from beginning to end, and that their childhood and youth had been mercilessly confiscated by an ideology. One of the instruments used for this was the Law on the Hitler Youth, dated the 1st of December 1936, which established the following. First, the future of the German people depends on youth. Therefore, the gathered German youth must be prepared for their future duties towards the people. Consequently, the Reich government has issued the following decree, which shall be promulgated here. Second, all German youth within the Reich shall be unified in the Hitler Youth. Third, all German youth, in addition to being raised within the family and at school, shall be educated in the Hitler Youth, physically, intellectually, and morally, in the spirit of National Socialism for the service of the people and the community. Fourth, the mission to educate the entirety of the German youth through the Hitler Youth is entrusted to the leader of the Reich for German youth in the NSDAP. He is the leader of the youth of the Reich. Therefore, he holds the position of a government authority based in Berlin under the immediate dependency of the Führer and Reich Chancellor. Fifth, all necessary regulations for the execution and consummation of this law shall be promulgated by him. Thus, by 1939, 7,728,000 youths were affiliated. These figures are astounding, but it must be remembered that affiliation was mandatory. Initially, the regime attempted to encourage affiliation with these groups through various measures, but starting in 1939, youths between 10 and 18 years of age were obliged to join. In addition, all competing youth organizations were prohibited, with the exception of the Catholic youth leagues. Teachers had to undertake additional duties and impose stricter discipline on those who did not belong to the Hitler Youth. There were four main organizations: German Youth, for boys from 10 to 14 years old; Hitler Youth, for boys up to 18 years old; Youth League, for girls from 10 to 14 years old; and German Youth League, for girls up to 18 years old. When the outbreak of the Second World War occurred, it exacerbated the situation within the Hitler Youth and its command structure, because now the group of older leaders, those of 17 years of age and older, was being called to the front lines. On the 1st of October 1939, 273 of the 424 highest full-time leaders in Chirac's administration had been recruited for combat. By the 1st of January 1940, 25% of all the leaders were at the front. Just under 2 years later, the percentage had risen to 60%. The war worsened what was already a problem in peacetime. The disappearance of older leaders forced the organization to replace them with others who were still very young, and lacked the necessary preparation to assume positions of responsibility in the Hitler Youth. By 1944, there were already boys of around 15 years of age leading peers of the same age, and during the last 2 years of the war, many young people could hardly believe that they were suddenly being promoted to a rank that in the Wehrmacht was equivalent to commander or higher. Lena Heydrich, the widow of the head of the SD, was beside herself when in July of 1944 she had to inform Himmler that because the Hitler Youth were being led by boys of 16 years old, her little son Haider was not receiving the recognition he deserved. Himmler acceded to her wishes and permitted that Haider be exempted from all service in the Hitler Youth from that moment on. At the moment of the capture of Berlin by the Red Army, all these young people were so convinced that their leader was guiding them on the right path that in their minds they only thought that if they won that war, they would surely decorate him with the Iron Cross for his valor in combat, for the services rendered to the homeland, and for his unwavering loyalty to his Führer, Adolf Hitler. Although, for the time being, some of them were content with proudly displaying the Merit Medal for Youth that they had obtained when they belonged to the Jungvolk, the child branch of the Hitler Youth. The insignia consisted of a victory rune, the symbol of the youth, surrounded by a circle of oak branch with the inscription Hitler Jugend and a swastika in the center. One of these young men was Hans Petersen, who also wore on his brownish military jacket a freshly affixed fabric insignia as a member of the improvised Feldherrenhalle detachment, one of the hundreds created by the youth on the day of general mobilization, when Berlin was encircled and the avalanche of Soviet fire was already looming over the center of the city. Hans and the 2 companions with whom he shared the dark basement were all that remained of the detachment. Of the approximately 90 boys that composed it, only they had survived the massacre. They had been sent to carry out a camouflage and attack mission not far from the Görlitz station on the Landwehr Canal. At first, they managed to surprise the Russians. The camouflage operation was a success. They destroyed 3 Soviet tanks, but a 4th tank appeared, one of those ISU 152s that provided rear guard for the first 3. And this provoked the carnage. Hans was there, at the canal, his moment of glory, having disabled 2 of the Russian tanks. However, the price paid by the youth boys was too high. The Russians had turned one of the buildings situated in front of the bridge into a center for rapes. Women, girls, even elderly women were raped there without mercy, some even to death. At night, the screams were so unbearable that the young soldiers could not stand them. They tried not to listen by singing and covering their ears, but some could not endure it. They drew their pistols and blew their own heads off. Many of these young men wanted to go there. They wanted to kill all the Russians who raped German women. Hans also hated them. He thought they were subhuman, as the party claimed, inferior beings endowed with an intrinsic wickedness, the product of their very nature. They drooled like mad when they saw a German woman. They stole, and they destroyed everything. The hordes from the east were now advancing upon the center of Berlin, destroying and laying waste everything in their path. Everything they occupied would be submerged in darkness and eternal silence. Hans firmly believed that for reasons such as these, they could not lose that war. It had been that same afternoon while they were trying to reach the Reichssportsfeld, when the virulent Russian attack was unleashed from all positions against the center of the city, and they were cut off, trapped in the central zone, the governmental district, the only place where they did not want to fight. Hans, who had been passionate about the war, who had listened to all the military reports while tracking on the gigantic map of Europe in the room of his house in Dahlem the advances of the glorious Wehrmacht and, unfortunately, its retreats as well. He, who had studied all the generals and their tactics, immediately understood that they had walked into a mousetrap. He knew that for the Russians, the governmental district was the grand prize, the crown jewel, the final act in the great final tragedy of the Third Reich. Hans was well aware that his friends were right. They had to try to reach the Reichssportsfeld by any means in order to come under the orders of the higher commanders of the youth. They would indicate to them what they had to do. the missions to be carried out and the positions to be defended. The central zone was not an area for children, it was an area for men. And Hans, who had dreamed all his life of being a soldier, understood that they were not soldiers, they were only children. Although he thought that they were very special children, children who had been forced by the war in a matter of days to make decisions that only men could make. The battle in the central zone demanded a different kind of decision-making, a kind of decision that was far beyond their knowledge. The situation of the battle in the governmental zone of Berlin in the early hours of the 29th of April was disastrous. The governmental zone was an enormous urban expanse that extended from the Anhalter station in the south to the bridges over the Spree in the north. The defense of the central zone was entrusted to General Wilhelm Mohnke, who in turn was under the orders of General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area. Both were directing the final defense of the city from the bunker complex, known as Bendler Block on Bendlerstrasse. Beneath this area, which was also known as Citadella, were, among other things, the defense of the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery itself, in whose bunker Adolf Hitler, Führer of the Third Reich, was directing the final defense of the capital from the bowels of the earth, from the last lair of the wolf. The forces defending this zone were the final expression of the gigantic disaster of the once all-powerful German war machine. In addition to the detachments of the Hitler Youth were members of the Volkssturm, the civilian militia that included party officials and even elderly people. Some of them had shown up in their old uniforms, ancient guillerminas, which made them look like characters straight out of an old war museum. To these young men, mostly children, were added thousands of personnel from a Wehrmacht in total decay, men who had been fighting for far too long, who were tired, exhausted, demoralized, men who had long ago lost their divisions and regiments, and who were literally fighting in retreat. There was a decimated 1st Regiment of the Waffen-SS Anhalt, somewhere near between the Kroll Opera House and the Ministry of the Interior on the other side of the great esplanade of Königsplatz, not far from the basement where Hans and his companions were located. The rest, ironically, was an authentic foreign legion, elements of the Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland, Scandinavians, some of the old Nordic SS divisions, such as the Niederland, the Norge, and the Freikorps Denmark. The remnants of the SS Grenadier Division Charlemagne, French, especially virulent in combat, and even volunteers from the Italian Black Shirts and the Spanish Blue Legion, because although General Franco had ordered their withdrawal in the winter of 1944, many of them continued fighting on a personal basis. All this made the Battle of Berlin an especially European battle. The Hitler Youth knew that what was being fought in Berlin was something more than the final act of the battle for Germany. It was the final battle for the control of Europe. If they failed, Western culture would die with them. Then all that was cultured, all that was beautiful, all that made life, struggle, and death worthwhile would disappear from the face of the earth. The young in the war believed that the Soviets would not stop at Berlin, nor in Germany. They would sweep through old Europe, and then the black veil of Asian culture would cover it all, for 1,000 years. This was what Dr. Goebbels had warned in the radio broadcasts that the youth had listened to. That was why, in no way, could they afford to lose that battle. They could not allow not only Berlin to become the funeral pyre of the Third Reich, but for Berlin to end up becoming the funeral pyre of Western culture. However, and as throughout the entire period of the war, the Jews suffered even in the final phase before the fall of Berlin, with the end in sight. Many German civilians considered themselves the primary victims of the war and remained blind to the misfortune of those who passed before them. In this terminal phase of Hitler's empire, the barriers that had previously existed between the orderly world of the Volksgemeinschaft and the underworld of the camps collapsed. Their guardians were no longer exclusively SS members, secretly bound by their oath, but also included retired military personnel, party officials, and members of the Hitler Youth. Executions and massacres no longer took place within the confines of a camp, but in ditches, forests, and the outskirts of towns and villages in Germany and Austria. The main technical problem posed by the mass murders was how to dispose of the corpses. In the extermination camps, they were incinerated in enormous pyres or in ovens. All this occurred knowing that the Red Army was advancing on Berlin and that they were practically already defeated in the war. But this did not stop the young who faithfully believed in Hitler from continuing to exterminate the Jews. On the 13th of March, 1945, the day on which 2,500 Berliners died as a result of aerial attacks, while another 120,000 were left homeless, Bormann ordered, for security reasons, that the prisoners held in areas near the front be transferred to the interior of the Reich. It is not entirely clear whether this measure also accelerated the evacuation carried out by the SS from the concentration camps threatened by the advance of enemy troops. The killings of sick prisoners and the mass execution of survivors undoubtedly constitute the most horrific episodes of the fall of the Third Reich. Those too weak to walk and those considered politically dangerous generally died by hanging or were shot by the SS or the Gestapo. At times, even the local Volkssturm was used to form firing squads. Overall, the largest number of those labeled dangerous were perhaps the men and women condemned simply for listening to a foreign radio station. The Gestapo and the SS also reacted brutally to looting, especially when it was committed by foreign workers. German citizens usually received pardon. In this frenzy of reprisals, perhaps it was the Italian forced laborers who suffered more than any other national group, perhaps due to the Germans' desire to take revenge on a former ally who had switched sides. With the fall of Berlin just around the corner, the headquarters that Schaeff had established in Reims that day sent a request to the Stavka in Moscow. General Eisenhower wishes to send a minimum of 23 accredited war correspondents to Berlin after the city is taken by the Red Army. In fact, he intends to send, if possible, a greater number, since, in his opinion, the fall of Berlin will constitute one of the greatest news stories in the world. During the German retreat toward the center of Berlin, the SS firing squads carried out their task as executioners with ever-increasing urgency and an unfeeling fanaticism. In the vicinity of the Kurfürstendamm, they broke into houses where white flags had been displayed to shoot everyone they found inside. Horrified by the momentum of the collapse, Goebbels described these signs of surrender as a pestilential bacillus. However, General Mummert, commander of the Müncheberg Armored Division, ordered the SS and Feldgendarmerie squads in his sector to surround the Anhalter station and the Potsdamer Platz, and threatened to summarily execute the executioners on the spot. Conditions gradually worsened for those embroiled in the fight. There were few occasions when German soldiers found themselves near a water pump, so they were forced to quench their thirst, exacerbated by smoke and dust, by drinking from the canals. There was also an increase in cases of nervous breakdowns caused by the combination of exhaustion and constant artillery fire. The number of wounded in the Anhalter bunker had grown so much that the young women had fashioned a Red Cross flag using sheets and lipstick. It was a futile effort, since even if Soviet artillery observers had spotted it through the smoke and dust caused by the falling debris, they would not have diverted their batteries' fire. A bunker was a bunker. One housing civilians was an irrelevant detail. Inside, the number of refugees was rapidly decreasing, however, as women and children fled through the U-Bahn and S-Bahn tunnels during the night of the 27th of April. In order to sustain the resistance, Bormann had spread, much like Goebbels and Ribbentrop, the false rumor of an agreement with the Western Allies. "Stand firm, fight with fanaticism," he had ordered the Gauleiters on the early morning of the 26th of April. "We are not going to abandon, we have no intention of surrendering. We are aware of the evolution of foreign policy. Heil Hitler." Signed, Reichsleiter Bormann. The lie led the young and the children, indoctrinated by Hitler, to give their lives defending Berlin, which ended in a terrible outcome. In the early days of May 1945, after the death of Adolf Hitler, and with Berlin's fall into the hands of the Red Army being a foregone conclusion, on the 9th of that same month at Marshal Zhukov's headquarters in Berlin, the Act of Surrender was signed, enshrining the unconditional surrender of Germany. World War II had concluded in Europe. However, the peoples of the world were unaware that that very city, which had served as the dramatic backdrop for the end of hostilities, would years later become the most dangerous focus of international tension, bringing the world to the brink of a new world war. The Berlin issue later became known as the Cold War. On Saturday, the 28th of April, 1945, with Berlin already practically in the hands of the Soviet armies, the first edict of the occupation forces was published, by which all political and administrative power of the city passed into the hands of the Supreme Soviet Commander. Based on that delegation of command of the Red Army, General Bersarin ordered the dissolution of the German National Socialist Party, as well as all its subsidiary organizations, Hitler Youth, Nazi Women's Union, Federation of National Socialist Students, etc., prohibiting their activities. It was also ordered that work be resumed in public services, transportation, hospitals, grocery stores and bakeries in order to restore order and supply the population as soon as possible. Public employees would remain provisionally in their positions, although banking operations were suspended. All these measures aimed to re-establish the normality of the city as quickly as possible. Undoubtedly, the fascist youth organizations used the young as a political symbol. Through the indoctrination of the Hitler Youth, a social base of young people was built, used as a symbol of loyalty to the fascist political project until the end of their days in power. The Hitler Youth, or Hitlerjugend, was established in 1922. After Hitler's rise to power in 1933, these organizations became so important that by 1936, they already had more than 5 million members. Active service went from being voluntary to compulsory. All boys and girls were forced to serve in this organization. The fascist school assumed the arduous task of shaping the young people who became the symbol of the purity of Nazi Germany. Young people who, in turn, were the target of the militaristic practices of the Third Reich, which considered them essential to sustain Hitler's expansionist project. These young people became little soldiers from a very early age. An example of this was the Nazi propaganda of the time, which featured posters stating, "Your body does not belong to you, it belongs to the nation," as was read on many of them. A former member of the Hitler Youth offers a glimpse into how their architects in National Socialism treated them. Hermann Grammel, born in 1928, concluded that there were many aspects of his life as a member of the Hitler Youth that he found attractive. The most important thing was that he and his friends had been courted and flattered without limits by the powerful political system of the Third Reich, and therefore he was proud to be part of the greatest youth organization ever created by it. He was attracted by the spiritual and national hymns and the almost cult-like activities with which young people were initiated into the movement, among them the oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler, the supreme leader. In the struggle to gain authority over children, which sometimes took place among the church, the schools, the parents, and the Hitler Youth, Grammel and his friends enjoyed being the center of attention and the object of adults' desires. Furthermore, the Nazi regime seemed to offer more support to the young in terms of ensuring them greater autonomy from their parents and allowing them to have liberal relationships with girls of their own age. Unlike the family, the church, or the school, the Hitler Youth was not burdened by tradition and taboos, and seemed to offer the young the exciting opportunity to be respected and responsible. When the time came to call them to the ranks, Grammel and his friends accepted the burgeoning war and their role as young soldiers as something they took for granted due to the paramilitary training they had received in the Hitler Youth. Both he and other young people had been preparing for a possible war for years, and they were not afraid of the prospect of going into combat on the front. On the contrary, Grammel recalls feeling motivated by a thirst for adventure, recklessness and risk, by a desire to flirt with danger. Yet not everything in the Hitler Youth was attractive to him, and certain aspects of the training went against his principles. The lessons on biological racism and the ideas of a global Germanic empire were too abstract for a young person. One of the great achievements of Nazi propaganda was its ability to offer an ideological and political vision of the world that guaranteed status, security, and power to the young, so much so that teenagers of both sexes could accept and abide by the prescribed norms of behavior with hardly any reservations. Through the elaborate process of propaganda and its dissemination of racial theory and notions of superiority, Hitler managed to shape both private and public behavior while reinforcing public support for the Nazi regime and the intimate bonds between the people and him, their Führer. The young, so full of ideals and energy, were inevitably especially vulnerable to such values in their personal quest for identity and meaning in their lives. In this way, the Nazis molded children and young people to give all their loyalty to Adolf Hitler, so that they would blindly fight for his ideals to the point of dying for them.